Okay, thank you everyone. I'm talking about engineering in a different sense, engineering within a quantum model, and within the kind of zigzag model that we have originally from Costa de Beauregard, since then from other people. So before we get to that, a comment on the day. I think a few of you know something special about this day from my point of view. It's my birthday. Even fewer of you know that it's a special birthday, which I think of as especially appropriate in this context. It's that one. You probably all realize that why that's so important because of the remarkable symmetry properties that this number has, not only spatially like that, but also. I think the last time this happened to me was when I was 11. The next time it happens to me will be when I'm 88. So possibly we can reconvene then. I think we should make the best of this one while we've got it.
Huw, just to tell you, I'm exactly the same age as you. So I would hope if I meet you when we're both 88 to this conference, I will buy everyone a drink.
we have that on tape.
Well, if you're all still here, beers are on me.
Okay, so this is what I really want to talk about, and it fits in with some of the things we've talked about this morning. I'm going to begin with the principle of the common cause. I'm taking it from the blurb from this book, which is also called the principle of the common cause. The common cause principle says that every correlation is either due to a direct causal effect linking the correlated entities, or is brought about by a third factor, the so-called common cause. Okay, and I'm going to use that here to explain my terminology, how I talk about superdeterminism and retrocausality. So for the case we're interested in, the case where you have some sort of correlation between measurement settings and hidden variables, in other words, a violation of statistical independence. I don't know how common this lovely symbol for correlation is. I only found one person, one statistician who uses it, but it's such an obvious one to think of there being some kind of spring that connects with it. So it just means the same as not dependent over that. And you can do it in LaTeX using a gluon symbol. You win both ways. Okay, so the principle tells us that there are basically two explanations for that. Either you can have a common cause, or on this side, the setting can be, well, a direct causal link, and there are two versions of that. One in which the setting causes the hidden variable, the other in which the hidden variable causes the setting. I'm assuming that it's the same for A and B. You could also imagine possibilities where it was a different explanation on the two sides, but let's leave those aside. Okay, so we've got three possibilities there. And this is how I use the terminology. So I call that one superdeterminism. I call that one retrocausality. Normally I don't bother to consider that one, but I think we could pop it in there as a special case of superdeterminism. It's like the case where lambda is playing the role of the common cause, and so they're identified. But I won't talk about that one. But what I'm talking about today is just the retrocausal case, not the superdeterminism case. Okay. And what I really want to talk about is colliders and selection bias. The term collider is a term from the causal modeling literature. And what it means is a point in a causal graph where two causal arrows meet in a common effect. This is what Seth was talking about this morning, some sort of variable which is influenced by two independent causes. So just to give you a little example, suppose that A and B are Alice and Bob. They're playing rock, paper, scissors. Each of them, on each player of the game, makes a choice from those three things. They send their choice to Colin, but now suppose that Colin doesn't like Bob. So Colin throws away all the results when Bob wins. Alice doesn't know that that's going on. She just sees the list of results. But it looks from her point of view as though she can influence Bob's choice. Not only influence it, but in this wonderful way. So whatever she chooses, Bob will choose the thing which makes him lose. Of course, it looks from Bob's point of view as he's got control too, only less happily. Okay, now that appearance there is just a causal artifact. It's a result of selection bias. There's no real causation in that case. Another name for this effect is Bergsons fallacy. Bergson was, I think, a medical statistician back in the 40s who published a paper about this because he'd noticed that there are common medical cases of this. So if, in his example, it was some condition which is caused both by diabetes and by something else. And if a person is hospitalized with that condition, if you just look at people who are hospitalized for that condition, there's a negative correlation between diabetes and the other things. And his point was that's not a real causal correlation, it's a selection artifact. Here's a familiar example in the literature these days. This is from a nice article by a person called Jordan Ellenberg. Why are human beings such jerks? I put this in because I don't know if you can read it. The caption here says, a model poses for a portrait during a casting call in Sydney. My hometown is Sydney, and I didn't realize before that Sydney was famous for handsome jerks. It's a nice piece if you want to read about Bergson's paradox. Here's a quote from it. Ellenberg says, if you try to improve your boyfriend's complexion by training him to act mean, you've fallen victim to so that if you select your boyfriends on the basis that they're either handsome or nice, then you will find this correlation. Those two variables will be anti-correlated in the selection set of your boyfriends. But it's not causal. You can't use it in that way. Okay, so that's selection bias, Bergson's fallacy. Now to an interesting puzzle for those of us who like to think about retrocausality. So there's a kind of causal picture of a typical Bell experiment. On both sides, you've got the setting having an influence on the hidden variable. But in causal model terms, that means that lambda is a collider. So here's a natural question. Is the Parisian zigzag, that is the supposed influence from one side of a Bell experiment to the other via this zigzag path, is that just a selection artifact due to the fact that there's a collider in the picture with the central vertex? And if so, is that bad news for retrocausal explanations of Bell correlations? Because it would imply that there's no real zigzag causality across this experiment. It's just a selection artifact. I want to answer the second question first. So I want to say to the second question, that is, if it is just a selection artifact, that would actually be good news, because it would mean that we'd get an explanation of the Bell correlations without any real space-like causality. And that looks like it would be good news. And we could throw away all our concerns about non-locality in the sense of action at distance or space-like causality, because we'd have an alternative explanation for these correlations, your selection artifact. Okay. And to sort of say a bit more about what you could do with that result if that was the right answer, I put a quote up here which comes from a famous experimentalist in this field. I don't have his permission to quote from his email, so that's why I'm not naming him. And he says, for me, the Costa de Beauregard zigzag in space-time, which you seem to consider equivalent to retrocausation, is nothing else than non-locality. The addition of one timeline vector to the past and one timeline vector to the future, connecting your detections, results in a space-like vector and a causal relation between both ends, space-like separated, amounts to a non-local relation. So if this was the right answer, then we wouldn't have a causal relation, and so we'd have an answer to that claim. And so this retrocausal model has a nice property of being what I understand in Switzerland is called a theory locale. I'll ask Nicholas about that. I took that picture years ago, just out of Constance in Switzerland. And I've been waiting for an opportunity. I didn't know that I'd have a Swiss chair, but I'm delighted. But for those of you who can't figure out what it means, you'll have to ask Nicholas. because it took me a long time to figure out what it meant. Okay, but we haven't answered the first question. Is it a selection artifact, or is there still some real causality in these cases? Well, that takes us to the more general topic of whether we can get causation across some colliders. So let's go back to our case of Alice and Bob again. We're looking at an ordinary sort of future-directed collider. Alice and Bob are playing rock, paper, scissors, sending their choices to Colin. But now let's suppose that Alice's fairy godmother has put a bit of bias into the universe as a whole. So that in games like this, wins break 60-40 in Alice's favor. Now, Colin doesn't need to do any post-selecting because it's just a sort of boundary condition of the universe. In this case, it seems to me, you might disagree, that would be interesting, but it seems to me to be true that Alice can influence Bob's choice, and similarly for Bob again. And, I forgot to say in the beginning that this is based on joint work with Ken. The reference was on the slide at the beginning. And when Ken and I were writing about this, we came up with what seems in some sense to be a real case, or at least a postulated real case of this. And this comes in connection of discussion of the black hole information paradox. And this is a proposal by Horowitz and Maldacena, helpfully described by Preskel in this piece. I'm embarrassed to try to explain it with Seth in the room, but I'll just quote. I think I'm quoting here from Horowitz and Maldacena. In the process of black hole evaporation, particles are created in correlated pairs, with one falling into the black hole and the other radiated to infinity. The correlations remain even when the particles are widely separated. The final state boundary condition of the black hole singularity, that's up here, acts like a measurement that collapses the state into one associated with the infalling matter. This transfers the information to the outgoing Hawking radiation in a process similar to quantum teleportation. But the crucial difference, as I understand it, is that unlike in quantum teleportation, there aren't a range of possible outcomes for that measurement at that point. There's this constraint which fixes the outcome. And the result of that, as you can see in this diagram from Perry, from a paper from last year, this is Perry's diagram from that paper. He says it's the Penrose diagram of a black hole that evaporates completely with a river showing the expected flow of quantum information. The interior of the black hole is therefore a strange place where one's classical notions of causality and unitarity are violated. This does not matter as long as outside the black hole, such pathologies do not bother us. So what's interesting from my point of view is that here we seem to have causal, a sort of zigzag causality going across a constrained collider. So at least to some degree, this is a postulated real example in the future, the future-directed case of how constraining a collider can actually produce causation across that collider. And zigzag causation is just it's not the particular zigzag that interests retrocausalists in the quantum context. Okay. So in the future case, then, it looks like the imposition of a constraint on a collider can result in genuine causality across the collider, at least by interventionist standards about what counts as genuine causality. I know that other people might have different stories they want to tell about causality. Sometimes they should have made a terminological remark about that at the beginning. But from my point of view, that's sufficient to count as causality. And with that in mind, let's now go back to the to the Parisian zigzag. So here's our retrocausal collider. Let's try and imagine a retrocausal version of rock, paper, scissors where Alice and Bob send their choices back in time to Larry, Lambda Larry, back in the past. Now, if you're doing this in complete generality, then as before, there are three possible outcomes at Larry: either Alice wins, Bob wins, or neither wins. But Larry has, like any other respectable experimenter, has access to low entropy sources and can choose in advance which outcome he wants. For him, that's a controllable input. And if he uses this control to introduce a bias, so for example, he makes sure that Alice always wins, then again we seem to have the kind of constraint on the collider that results in genuine causal influence across the collider, just as in the future constraint cases. So I think the right answer is that we can get causality across the collider in retrocausal models in the Bell case. But what it depends on is the fact that, unlike normal colliders in the future, this one is also something that we can control in our experiment. So we can put in by hand control over that collider, and it's in virtue of that that we can have causation from one side to the other, to the very limited degree that we do actually have it in the Bell case. Okay, so there are my conclusions. There is a way to engineer a genuine causal zigzag from the two zigs, the two retrocausal zigs that are provided by retrocausality in these cases. But it's unusual. It's an unusual kind of causality because it depends on this phenomenon that we're calling the constrained collider. Okay, so that's basically it. Just a little bit of history. There are actually two zigzag cafes in Paris, but this one is a particularly interesting one because it's between the Sorbonne and École Polytechnique. I'm not sure how long it's been there, but I would be surprised if Costa de Beauregard didn't know about it. I don't know if there's any terminological connection. But let's put it into the picture. So here he is explaining the zigzag. Here we both are. I met him once around about 2004, 2005. I think it was the year before he died. He kindly invited Guido Vaccialupi and me out to lunch with him and his wife outside France. That's it. Thank you.